Welcome to San Francisco, a podcast where each episode will bring you one story from behind the liberal front of the West Coast so-called capital of innovation and progress and expose a myth about the city and the liars behind that myth.
This is San Francisco.
I am Toshio Moronic. I'm a writer who's reported for Al Jazeera, Truth Out, and In These Times. And if you think you might be interested in the life of a Black trans revolutionary, I do have a book collaboration with a Black trans revolutionary coming out. The Stonewall Riots veteran, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, out on Verso in January of 2023. But you can pre-order it now from anywhere you can get a book. Mia, we've known each other for a minute, but I haven't talked to you in a minute. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Well, it's so good to finally be in a Zoom room and chatting, and after all the frantic work that we were doing to really challenge our community. But hi, everyone. My name is Mia. I use they, she pronouns. I'm an educator and an organizer who I'm fifth generation Japanese American, and a lot of my most recent organizing work within the Japanese American community comes from an organization called Nikkei Resistors. For a lot of reasons, I'm also a grad student trying to really quickly finish my thesis, and I work at a student center at UC Berkeley serving Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Swana students. So that organizing is slowed down, but hopefully over the course of the next few months, we'll be able to have some really cool conversations around Nikkei, that's diasporic Japanese American organizing. So be sure to check us out at Nikkei Resistors, mostly on Instagram.
Definitely do that. All right. Well, welcome to San Francisco, where anti-Asian violence is manipulated and weaponized by the Chamber of Commerce and landlords to increase homelessness. In really basic terms, this is a story of people in the real estate industry using Stop Asian Hate in a cynical way. In the case of this story, constructed a very us versus them situation where elders and children in Japantown were sort of pitted against quote unquote dangerous homeless people. And also where the city had funding and an opportunity early in the still ongoing COVID pandemic to convert empty hotels throughout the city into permanent supportive housing for houseless people. And so we met because of this issue, and I think it really pissed us both off, could I say?
Deeply pissed off.
And we also happen to be, both Japanese American, and felt like there were these voices in the Japanese American community here in San Francisco that were kind of taking up maybe more space than they should around this particular issue and claiming that they were the singular voice about the issue. There was this false narrative. This was last year, 2021. I can't believe it has already been a year. They created this false narrative that all Japanese Americans in San Francisco felt a certain type of way about transitioning these empty tourist hotels into permanent housing for houseless people, which is a population that has just continued to grow, as I think probably anyone listening to this podcast will know. It's not helping that the land and the housing here is just so commodified, and in contrast to what people, I think, from outside often claim about San Francisco, which is that we are this haven for houseless people. Again, I will restate, so it's kind of a complicated issue with a lot of layers. There was a moment last fall when a few Japanese Americans, speaking like they were all Japanese Americans in San Francisco, essentially said, we're not interested in helping to improve the lives of a couple hundred of our neighbors who don't have a place to live right now, early in the pandemic. And they said this at a time when the state and the feds were offering money to different cities, municipalities to renovate unused buildings into like perfectly livable, kind of dorm-like SRO, single room occupancy style hotels that exist around the city already. In particular, the biggest property that they were looking at was a big empty hotel in Japantown that was for a few years prior to the pandemic when it closed. It was briefly the Kimpton Buchanan Hotel. We were both kind of pissed at how it did feel like not only were there certain people in the Japanese American community who were more concerned about the values of land and using this idea of anti-Asian hate, which is a very real crisis, but so is like the houselessness crisis, to up property values. Also, the campaign against converting this Buchanan Hotel into permanent housing, I remember there just being so many cheerleaders online that were creating the narrative, it seemed, because Pacific Heights is adjacent to Japantown, and there's a few like big headquarters for these real estate firms and realtors. It seemed like they were manipulating these stories of racism and of internment, even like the history of redevelopment here in San Francisco, which we can talk a little bit about later, and using that to like bleach the area and to kind of make it whiter. And you had been doing work with Nikkei resistors, and through you, I found out about some of the kind of more subtle political forces at play here. And you helped me kind of understand, like, okay, this is how we should approach a response to this. Whether or not that response gets heard, we don't know. But we were like, we have to do something. Yeah. You are clued in more with the community here. You have, relationships with other JA, that's short for Japanese American, like activists and elders. And I had been super stoked about the work around immigration policy. And also the reparations work that JA elders were doing in relation to talking about internment and talking about the fact that Japanese Americans were the only ethnic group, racial group to receive some kind of reparations from the government in response to something really fucked up that the government had done in the past. Yeah. And it was also a personal topic for me, not because I've written a lot about the housing crisis in San Francisco, but also because I am half Japanese and my grandparents were in internment camps. So the sort of like weaponizing language that was used was pretty annoying. Yeah.
It was kind of just like, you all are just completely and intentionally like misrepresenting our history. And yeah, I think like in saying like, this is just like Executive Order 9066, like I feel like all that, I think we I can't remember if we were texting or whatnot. I internally lost it. I was just like, so I think that was so frustrating. And I think both the misrepresentation and understanding of our history. And I think, just a complete sort of like removal of understanding how our community was formed and like why J-Town is the way it is. Again, to just continue to like serve the needs of wealthy Japanese Americans, realtors, and sort of the bourgeois and politicians, like just seeing it happen in real time. When we had been reading, when I'd been reading about it, was just so infuriating. But then seeing people who had previously were against redevelopment applying the same lines as redevelopment, right? And I was, God, it was,
that's what it was.
Awful. It was so awful. Yeah, I feel like when we talk about this, I remember a year ago, I think like maybe even to this day is when I think they might have announced about the hotel. Like that they were going to buy it. It might be this exact date, October.
Yeah, I think you're right. I know it was right around now, and it kind of like jogged my memory, and I was like, oh, I should hit up Mia about this.
So yeah, I feel like a year ago, I was just like on my floor crying.
It was, yeah, no. So, the executive order 9066 that you referenced, that is the order that President Truman gave that led to most, if not all, Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants to be forced into camps in a matter of days. They headed there with 2 suitcases. Mm-hmm. Did you have family that experienced that?
Yeah. Oh, actually, just to clarify, it was Roosevelt who.
Roosevelt. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a whole piece on that. But yeah, my grandma's side of the family, they were in LA. And so yeah, had to comply with the incarceration orders. And they first went to Heart Mountain and then to Tule Lake because they had elected to.
Grandma went there.
Yeah.
I had a grandparent at Tule Lake, and then the other one was at, I think it's called Roar in Arkansas.
Yeah.
We still have some pictures from those times. It's pretty wild. It just happened in like a matter of days. And people, at least, in my grandparents' case, they turned to some of their neighbors. They lived in like a somewhat mixed neighborhood. Sometimes those neighbors kept the stuff. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes they sold it, and people were coming back with nothing. That was before redevelopment, which was this scheme that hit a lot of U.S. cities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Kind of continues today, just under a different term, because people were like, that was hell. We don't want anything like that to ever happen again. So they had to rebrand it. But I think a lot of the gentrification that we see today, it's playing out like the redevelopment. These orders from urban planners working within cities and collaborating with other urban planners. I mean, I admit that makes it sound like a conspiracy, and it partially was, because it's not like the public was like privy to all these conversations where straight up, at least in San Francisco, Justin Herman, who's kind of like this infamously bad dude who had a whole park named after him down by the waterfront on East Bay. And, they took his name off of it because he basically called for the removal of Black people from the Fillmore here, and also in Japantown, Filipinx people and other Asian immigrants that were living in Manila town. In some ways, like, it's amazing to see communities that were able to recover, but a lot of people just had to leave.
Right.
Early in the COVID pandemic, if you were homeless and you got infected with COVID, you were 3 times more likely to die than if you were not homeless. And these numbers are off of a press release from the desk of California Governor Gavin Newsom, who was also our mayor before he climbed the political ladder a bit. And it's not like when he was mayor here, he was necessarily a friend of homeless people, but there was a lot of pressure on politicians everywhere to address this very serious public health emergency. It just so happened that, like a lot of things in society, it was a public health emergency that affected you more if you didn't have stable housing. That's for many reasons. Like, people who are houseless tend to have more disabilities, and as we know, like, people who have chronic health issues are way more susceptible to really bad and potentially deadly effects of COVID. The governor's office launched Project Home Key, and they dedicated $6 billion, which was a massive amount that is unheard of when it comes to addressing homelessness, more money than it had ever spent on alleviating the houselessness crisis, aka the housing unaffordability crisis, aka crisis of, the smaller and smaller number of landlords owning more and more of housing. All of these are crises that are getting worse everywhere. It's not just in San Francisco, but I do think that San Francisco happens to be a pretty good example of this awful problem. I don't know if you remember this moment. Just before the pandemic, there was like a United Nations special rapporteur.
Yeah.
She had not good things to say. And a lot of those things were related to the wealth gap, which because, San Francisco is like, I think it's the second densest city after New York in the US. It's like, it's hard not to see because you can walk one block and the environment kind of changes. I think a lot of tourists notice that when they come through. Even my parents, like, they'll comment on it because they live in the suburbs. So they're not used to that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The UN Special Rapporteur, I mean, the report was scathing, talked about how residents who were homeless were being denied access to just the most basic things like water, sanitation, health services. It constituted, quote, cruel and inhuman treatment and was a violation of multiple human rights, including the rights to life, housing, health, water, and sanitation. That sort of discrimination should be ceased immediately, is to paraphrase what the report said. It was inhumane and an indication basically that San Francisco did not give a shit about human rights. And so the story picks up from the governor's office down to the mayor's office here in San Francisco. Our mayor, London Breed, at this point was challenged to actually give homeless people a roof over their heads. That wasn't just like a temporary shelter that they may or may not have a bed at the next day, or like their possessions might not be safe there, or they can't bring their dog, or just all of these different factors that make it so that, it's pretty clear, like, for anyone who has stayed in a shelter, it's not a place you want to like call home forever. There were the obvious public health reasons that the mayor had to address, which included the spread of COVID. And moving people inside to empty tourist hotels was actually a good way to slow the spread. That worked out for these hotel owners who got paid by the government to fill what would have been totally empty hotel rooms. And the state and federal government at the time, they're both sending all this money to cities and counties. A lot of the money had sort of like deadlines that you had to use it by. It was also supposed to specifically help solve this crisis, which was a crisis before the pandemic made it a worse crisis, and into this, still happening, ongoing crisis of houselessness and housing unaffordability. And again, the few really, really rich people hoarding all the property that they can. And so these, what they call shelter in place or SIP hotels, they were always going to be temporary. And the mayor made that very clear. However, she also made a promise, which was that every person living at a shelter-in-place hotel would be housed when the city decided to close these hotels down. This isn't that long ago. Again, it's 2021 we're talking about. Wild. We had this small window of time where there was a huge opportunity to use this $6 billion in addition to other federal funds, other state funds that we were being handed as a city and county for COVID relief, and to use the Buchanan Hotel in Japantown, which had already signaled that it was going to shut down. The SF Homelessness and Supportive Housing Department also identified a few other hotels, but Japantown's Buchanan Hotel was the largest. It had been owned by a British corporation, IHG, which also owns like the Intercontinental Hotels. That's what it's short for. Holiday Inn, and some other properties. And just a few years before, it had been sold to them by Best Western, which is based in Arizona. And at the beginning of the pandemic, they did offer the city a temporary lease that meant that the city could use it as a shelter-in-place kind of COVID hotel for houseless people. It was already sort of retrofitted, and like people could have like either stayed, people could have moved straight into these empty hotel rooms, And once the time ran out on these shelter-in-place hotels, IHG was like, we'll totally sell you this place. Like, we don't see it as being that profitable. However, in October of 2021, 1 year ago, real estate developers and a few Japantown residents kind of slid a sword into those plans. So instead of converting this failed 131-room tourist hotel into long-term housing for people who needed it desperately, the city backed off, and it felt like it was very much due to a misinformation campaign spread in part by other Japanese Americans. There's a statement, and we'll include it in the show notes, that was shared by a few Japantown nonprofits. And it basically said that San Francisco's Japantown was under attack by low-income San Franciscans. There was a petition that was related to that was promoted in the LA-based Japanese-American newspaper, Rafu Shimpo, which, I don't know if you know, I think it's the largest Japanese-American paper in the States.
Yeah.
And they claim that creating permanent housing for elders and disabled people who are homeless basically would lead to, quote, irreparable harm on the SF Japantown neighborhood, end quote. And also that Japanese American culture in Japantown was at risk. Again, I mean, it's hard not to go back to this statistic, like 3 times more likely to die. Like the pandemic hadn't even been declared over by President Biden. And certainly Mayor Breed was still masking up at her PR events, except for those events where she was caught without the mask, despite there being a mask mandate. I don't know if you saw, I mean, it's weird because it's like mayor shit. But Mayor Breed has like the briefest Matrix 4
yes.
moments.
Oh my God.
She doesn't have like a line or anything like that.
Yeah.
But she does have a name in the credits. Previous to that, I know that she had done like some things with like Jamie Foxx was coming through town with like sort of like Black Lives Matter bus that was driving around the States. I'm just going to say, yeah, she's never not going to head to an invitation for some chance to get in front of the camera.
Oh, yeah.
Some Japanese American residents of the Bay Area, which is indigenous Ohlone, Lisjan, and Ramaytush land before it was anything else, didn't agree with pushback against the Japantown hotel conversion plan. And some of the people that didn't agree with that included us, because there were others who did see the pushback against housing homeless people as kind of an anti-homeless misinformation campaign that would just increase suffering for other people and keep property values high for a few people. The other thing it did was it kind of like cynically misused the recent attention around racist anti-Asian violence, and also rewrote that history of practices against redevelopment in the 1960s, because there was a sizable number of Japanese Americans who were speaking out against redevelopment and the city taking people's houses by eminent domain and saying like, oh, we need to build a freeway here. We need to do something with it. We just don't want people of color on this land. So we also knew if it accomplished its goal, this anti-homeless campaign would benefit landlords and real estate developers most of all. Really, Japanese Americans that were trying to run defense for real estate. I don't know why I just used like I think it's a football reference, but moving on, they were choosing the wrong target and erasing the fact that there are indeed homeless people living in the Bay Area right now who are also Japanese American. Mm-hmm. Erasing Japanese Americans who were currently or formerly homeless, including a lot of Japanese American World War II internment survivors who often left the camps after the war with nowhere to go because they were evicted from their homes by landlords and local sheriff's departments at the onset of internment. And so for me, the true, like, I guess, predator slash villain in this story wasn't the imaginary monster of knife wielding homeless people who were leaving trails of needles everywhere they went, but more the people who were using the Japanese American community's trauma to kind of traumatize another community. And I wouldn't like place blame on like all Japanese Americans, even all Japanese Americans that like signed on to this. I mean, there was the fear around the anti-Asian hate that really popped off like after some violence against Asian elders in Oakland, I remember. And then of course, like the shooting in Atlanta soon thereafter. But can't really be down for people using those situations in order to prop up real estate values.
Yeah. I would also say too, like, I feel like a couple of the people who mentioned in the public comment about the violence were like, because their cameras were on, were like white folks or people who presented as white.
Allies.
Yeah. So there were two people that I was like, and I think there's one person I remember, she like said she wasn't Asian, but she like was like worried for so like there was also like non-Asian folks and Asian American folks who were, you know, in that call, like stoking that.
Solidarity.
Yeah, right. So there's also, that layer of some folks feeling afraid and then also other people like creating this narrative to further, right. Yeah. Oh God, there's a lot of messed up things that came up in public comment that I think really sort of exposes all of the embedded vile issues that the hotel was covered for, right?
Yeah. And I've been on some of the public comment sessions I was on for this particular issue. You have to be really dedicated. There's a lot of people that work in real estate that get paid to be there, basically. They're on the clock. People who might have spoken up against this, I mean, sure, some of them might have come from some of the nonprofits that are working on behalf of houseless people, but by and large, like some of these calls or these meetings are happening at times when people are having to work, and a lot of times they're not super well publicized. So you got to be in the know, and you have to like really be dedicated if you're not getting paid to like take a few hours out of your day, potentially not even knowing if you're gonna get to do public comment, because sometimes they'll cut it off after a certain point. I'm sure that was pretty discouraging, but kind of funny. Yeah, if you have these like just straight up like real estate allies, like being like, this is an issue that I really care about, and I need to speak up for my Japanese American friends out there. Mm-hmm. But not the homeless people that live in San Francisco that happen to be Japanese American or Asian American. Another argument that people were making was Japantown Center, which is a mall that sits pretty central within Japantown and is maybe like, I guess I would say like the most visible signal that you are in Japantown, because there's the temple structure. Mm-hmm. Why am I blanking on what that's called? Oda. My mom would be like, yes, thank you. The Japantown Center Mall, it wasn't like it was locally owned, just like IHG Hotels is not locally owned, but it was owned by investors hundreds of miles south in Beverly Hills who, you know, were, I think, a bigger threat to cultural disruption in Japantown, because in 2006, these two investment companies had purchased most of the land that Japantown Center Mall sits on. At the time, back in 2006, they did sign a 15-year agreement that the city was brokering with the community, stating they would not convert the space into condos during that time, and then they would keep the, you know, signal that, okay, this is Japantown. This isn't just like anywhere USA, like globalization town. They would keep the flavor, I guess. I've looked at the documents. I mean, it's dry content, but if not for this contract, you know, it's potentially this Japan Center would have already been converted. Yeah. And the agreement expired last year. It has not yet been renewed. Even before COVID-19, there was a lot of reports that these owners in Beverly Hills were fleeting the place empty as people's leases expired, the small businesses. If you check out the owners, one's called Langdon Street Capital, the other one's called 3D Investments. They're, they just have the most boilerplate language about what they do that makes it also so vague that it's hard to really understand for the layperson what exactly they do. That said, Langdon Street Capital seeks to acquire, manage, develop, and finance, as well as add value, paraphrase, urban infill real estate through syndication of equity and joint venture partnerships. 3D Investments, quote, prides itself on providing attractive investment options for investors from all over the globe. Extra vague. They refuse to negotiate rents with small businesses, resulting in it's kind of a dead mall almost today. Not just because of the pandemic, though, because the 3D and Langdon were not really willing to work with the businesses on their rents during the pandemic. And so the city basically had to come in because they had the small business rent, commercial space, rent forgiveness program for a minute, which is now over. Part of their unwillingness to negotiate with people locally, I'm just going to guess maybe it had to do with the fact that in 2007, a year after they bought that land, they already were working with architects to draw up plans for these luxury condos to replace that mall.
Yeah. I don't know Langdon, but 3D always comes up as kind of the villain in this story. When community leaders, they have a very hostile and not, it's very obvious in that, but it's I didn't even know the owners, but I've heard enough in J-Town, 3D is a really cause they don't actually care. Right. And they're actually very much invested in having this be turned into luxury housing. That's 100%. I don't know if people go on the record because for saying it, but it's definitely the best kept, well-known secret. Everyone's them.
But then still are kind of at their mercy because they own this land. That's right, the most visible part of Japantown. It's just off of Geary, and it's where I guess I thought of as Japantown when I first moved here. If anti-homeless campaign leaders were interested in solving violence, helping small businesses, and preserving local Japanese American culture, maybe demand that the city help homeless and low-income San Franciscans, Japanese Americans or not, by purchasing as many empty buildings as possible to give people somewhere to stabilize their lives instead of enriching 3D or enriching Langdon. The city, like it did back in the 50s or 60s, could fully implement eminent domain. I know it's not something that's used by cities very often anymore because they don't like the precedent that it potentially sets. But the city had requisitioned people's houses in the then Black Fillmore and also in Japantown and, of course, in Manilatown to build freeways and what have you. They could do the same thing today. So this argument that permanent supportive housing for houseless people would destroy the community, it sort of, through you, I learned a little bit more about how it rewrote the history of Japanese American activism and tenant organizing. Because in the 1960s, the notoriously cruel Justin Herman running the SF Redevelopment Agency, which is no longer called that because it has bad vibes. He actually called the land, quote, too valuable to permit poor people to park on it. And so he's backed by groups like Spur, these other urban planning groups, to try to move the city's population just generally closer to the standard white Anglo-Saxon Protestant characteristics. So it was too diverse in San Francisco for Justin Herman. They did succeed in displacing hundreds of Japanese Americans, but even more so than that, the Black communities nearby and the adjacent Filipinx communities were devastated. The city at the time promised people that they would relocate them and offer them financial assistance, but it rarely worked out to where people felt supported and a lot of people were left houseless. However, yeah, you introduced me to this group that was called Committee Against Nihonmachi Evictions, CANE. And it seems like they were able to work with some of the other groups that the city was trying to sort of divide and conquer and like pit Japanese Americans against like Black people in San Francisco, against Filipinx people in San Francisco. CANE was like, no, we are going to work with these other communities to make sure that we're tenants, they're tenants. We need to work together to save Japantown, the Fillmore, and if we can, Manilatown. In some cases, through direct action. In some cases, they worked with people, like some of the same people were out at the I Hotel, which is locally, I would say, a pretty famous story, and like in like a maybe Asian American West Coast history, a semi-famous story of like a hotel in Manilatown that was not saved, but not for lack of trying. And I think if there hadn't been so much activism around a hotel where mostly Filipinx immigrants were living and were evicted, without that activism, there would have been a lot graver consequences. And then eventually it did lead to, there's now senior housing on the space that previously the I Hotel existed. Activists there, like Tony Robles, do attribute the like straight up direct action as one of the main reasons for the existence of this senior housing for Filipinx elders. So what ended up happening is the Buchanan Hotel, because of this pushback that was very like misleading, the campaign worked. Unfortunately, the hotel that caused the controversy, the Buchanan, is still closed as of today. I called, and it may reopen.
Oh
They still have the message. It's like one of these creepy, like ghostly messages from like start of pandemic times, where it feels like almost like something out of a time capsule, because it's like this person at reception just being like, we don't know what's going to happen, and we hope you stay healthy, but bye. It's creepy. Yeah, the voicemail is still working, but you can't make any current reservations. They do have reservations I saw open for December, but that was pushed back already. I guess some silver lining exists in the fact that the city did end up buying a smaller hotel nearby, and it had 114 rooms that were, very immediately filled. It's still about 25 fewer rooms than they would have had at the Buchanan, and still thousands of rooms fewer than would really make a huge dent in houselessness and like the tragedies that like stem from the city not really doing right by its people. And the city also acquired a few other buildings around the city. And all of these hotels and these condo buildings, I mean, the developers were super stoked, because essentially it was a bailout on, condos or hotels that were a flop and nobody was trying to buy, or in a hotel's case, stay in at the time. But London Breed, as mentioned, had promised to find supportive housing for all the people once the city closed down the shelter-in-place hotels. That did not happen. The city's claim is that it acquired 2,918 housing units during the pandemic up to last August. But in a city with more billionaires per capita than any other city in the world, feels like not the biggest win.
There's so much like overlap in the way that like people are using ethnic nationalism to like displace working class people of color and poor people of color and houseless people of color. And then there's also like a lesson of how people of our own community like rewrite the history to like sell the narrative for those in power, right? So I think there's so much I'm seeing like this overlap of wow, like because one thing I was going to add is after this whole thing, I did some research, and actually like and that you named the Chamber of Commerce in the redevelopment period, they had a different name and I'm forgetting it, but the JA Chamber of Commerce actually supported redevelopment, right? And so they were like the key instigators that right, all of the mall used to be like small businesses, like housing, and they supported that because they wanted to. And I got a lot of this from Meredith Oda's book, like Gateway to the Pacific, right? They were
Check that out.
invested in like changing J-Town to fit tourists and this like US Japan post-war geopolitical relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Just seeing like, I'm just like seeing what's happening the same way again, where again, like organizations that have like a lot of like social capital or just like wealth, like are trying to create a certain narrative at the detriment of, again, working class, poor, immigrant folks that live there, you know?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's so much like, I think a key part of this is why I think I was so angry in the processes is that it's a lot of our own people, a lot of our own JAs who did, you know, experience, right? A lot of these Chamber of Commerce folks in redevelopment, right? Experienced incarceration. There's like in such a complexity with Japanese empire and all that stuff that I think funneled money to certain people that they're actively like so supportive.
Oof.
And like wanting to kick out. Like there's a paragraph in her book where they were like, we don't want like auto shops. We don't want laundries in our neighborhood, right? Like that is not metropolitan, cosmopolitan.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what we want is like Disneyland for white people, like, but Japanese style.
Yeah.
Kimonos.
Yep.
I mean, relatively, the Japanese American community is smaller here, but it is still far from a monolith because there are people of all different classes. Like there are people who will take these stories of being really put out by redevelopment and, you know, twist them into stories that benefit them at, like you said, the expense of other Japanese Americans and other people that live in the area more generally.
I'd say folks who are interested in like the content that we talked about in this podcast, I really think J-Town Action and Solidarity is probably, I think, the best organization because I think they inherently like include an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist lens. And so I think that's what has fallen apart in a lot of other Japanese American spaces when talking about this. It's buying into, again, Japanese post-war propaganda line about like the lack of cultural purity. So right, there's this whole line about like Japantown is destroying, like dying, right? But what does that actually mean?
Right.
Knowing that there's still so many of us JAs here and like in the way that you can't have a community thrive if its model is based off of tourism, right? So, and I think the only folks I really see having that awareness that you can have a thriving J-Town that also serves the like material needs of non-JA folks. Like that is actually not contradictory in any way. But I think other spaces see that as in contradiction, that for there to be non-JA folks in the community means the community is dying. Like that's they're really saying, you know?
Ooh, that is some empire shit. Japanese empire stuff coming out from the island.
God. So yeah, I definitely think that why I would really recommend supporting their acronym is JAS. So yeah, supporting them and following their work.
Definitely follow
they also
them.
try to do a lot of political education that explains like how do we understand this, right? They have like the specific direct actions, but again, their narrative is always connecting it to like a larger vision of freedom, which I think is really important. So we don't get stuck. Because I think the other side story with this that's related to this that I learned from elder in Kane is that the site where the hotel is, Buchanan Hotel, used to be housing for like working class community. And they fought really hard as Kane to preserve it as housing for the people who live there. And now it's this hotel. And she was talking, she was like, they've totally missed the purpose of what Kane was. Not about preserving a JA ethnicity or presence. It's about housing. It's about like material direct needs and services for the community. And she continues to do work with supporting like houseless folks in the East Bay. So for her, right, by maintaining that connection to that vision, like it was so obvious. But I think for other folks, right, they became settled, right? Because they're like, okay, now we have the pagoda, now we have these centers, like now we have all these events that got very comfortable in that and assumed that was the like markation of success.
It's serving everybody in the community. Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas folks who still maintain doing community mutual aid work were like, no, this is like so far from our vision of what we wanted.
Thank you to Mia Summers of Nikkei Resistors, who you can find on social media and also contact at nikkeiresistors@gmail.com. It's NIKKEI Resistors. This and every episode of Sad Francisco was produced by Toshio Moronic and Caitlin Wood. If you can, please help us out by going to sadfrancis.co, where you can contribute toward the editing and transcriptions of the show. Again, that is sadfrancis.co, sadfrancis.co. And in exchange, you'll get bonus episodes plus more. Talk to you soon.